beginning, 100 refugees were coming across the border. Now he's seeing 20,000 refugees through his town. He says 1 million is one thing. If it gets to 2 million in this country, he thinks Poland's going to have a problem. Kira?
We'll continue to talk about it, of course, with you every day, Phil. Thank you so much. Our Phil Lipoff in Warsaw, Poland. Well, this war in Ukraine is dramatically changing all aspects of the children's lives. 7.5 million children we're talking about who are now fleeing from the impact and the access to clean water, sanitation, their mental health, even closed schools, all of these things impacting them every day. Joining me now for more on this, UNICEF spokesperson James Elder, who is near the border of Poland and Ukraine. James, as we watch this war escalate, what is your biggest concern right now as you interact with these kids, especially those who have fled their homes and lost everything?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is still seeing your images there, seeing what happened in Mariupol, just to know that we're now seeing indiscriminate attacks, hitting more civilian targets. Women, this should be their greatest moment, no, having a baby for the first time, becoming a mother, and they're being bombed while they're doing it. So that scale of children being killed remains, of course, our greatest concern. Side by side, a million children who've been ripped away from one member of their family, who watching traumatized mums who are freezing, as you say, it's bitterly cold here, who have left behind, you know, the school, the friends, and have come to learn what bombs sound like. The trauma of those children, the need for them to get education, is an immense concern to UNICEF right now.
And so many of these children, as we've been looking at the pictures, were only able to bring a few belongings with them. And on top of that, they have no idea, James, when they'll be able to return home. So how are you trying to encourage them right now? What are those conversations like?
Yeah, you know, and every person wants to come home. I've spoken to hundreds of people. I spend days at that train station in Lviv in Ukraine or the border, and every single person, this is their home. The brain drain from this nation is heartbreaking. But I spoke to a little girl the other day, and I said, "Do you know where you're going?" And she said, "No, I don't know the name of it. Is it in English?" "No, I don't know the name. And I also don't know the name of my village, but I love my village and I want to go back there." So these are just kids, but right now they can't because their parents have had to make a decision that is mind-boggling to most of us, that do I leave my husband and our child's father, and do we leave? And they just decided a million times that, yes, the only way to keep our child safe, to ensure that we are not one of those children in a playground or a school that gets hit by these attacks, the only way we can guarantee our child is alive next week is to leave. And that requires an immense amount of support, which we are doing our best to get to, from medical supplies to education supplies. It also, as you know in your correspondence, it requires that humanitarian corridor to be respected so people can get out without being shelled and we can get in.
As a country, how can we help these Ukrainian kids right now, James?
Well, I think this is what Americans do, you know, giving. I would love to say there was something else and it wasn't can you put your hand in your pocket? I really would, but the medical supplies that we brought in, and the medical supplies we'll bring in again tomorrow, and they go to hospitals and surgeons who are working in bunkers and delivering babies, or the children I've seen with wounds of war who come across. Those medical supplies, for example, they cost money. UNICEF, we're entirely donor funded. So any mums or dads who could do that, you know, to unicefusa.org, that makes an immense difference. That gets supplies onto that truck and then to those kids that I've been seeing.
James Elder, thank you, and thank you for all the work that you do just again and again. And we will continue to tell everybody who asks how they can help. This is how you do it. UNICEF is working in Ukraine and throughout the region to provide urgent and aid and assistance to children and families. You can learn more, as James mentioned, unicefusa.org/ABC. And among those making a difference in the region is world-renowned Spanish-American chef Jose Andres. He's on the ground. helping feed Ukrainian refugees. We are going to speak with the CEO of his nonprofit, World Central Kitchen. More special coverage right after the break.
America's #1 news, ABC News. Most watched, most trusted, and streaming live to you anytime, anywhere, and free. This is ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news, free to you 24/7. Watch America's #1 news whenever you want it, wherever you are, anytime. ABC News Live, streaming live and free on all platforms.
War in Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis. Here again, Kira Phillips.
Welcome back, everyone. You know, every day we continue to hear these heartbreaking stories about refugees fleeing from this horrific war. And then so many of them don't even know what happens next once they escape the war zone. It can be a brutal experience, but thankfully so many people one of them, his nonprofit, World Central Kitchen has been on the ground serving hot meals to all the Ukrainian refugees. And joining us now from Lviv, Ukraine is Nate Mook, CEO of World Central Kitchen. Nate, so glad you're with us.
Thank you so much for having me tonight.
So you are on the ground there. Describe to us what you have been seeing and what you're working with right now.
Yeah, so our team started to work initially along the Poland border just 24 hours after the attack began and Ukrainians began to flee the country into neighboring countries. We've set up hot meal distribution points at every single border crossing with Poland, along with in Romania, Moldova, and Hungary as well. I'm here in Ukraine, in Lviv, which is in the western side of the country, relatively peaceful here. There are air raid sirens on occasion, but this has become sort of the humanitarian center for the country as Ukrainians flee the east. Cities like Kharkiv and Kherson and Kiev, which are actively under bombardment, and come over this direction. So Lviv right now is just overwhelmed with Ukrainian families, many women and children especially, who have left their homes and are here either looking to eventually cross the border, or many of them will just stay here in Lviv waiting to see what's going to happen next. So we have kitchens active here in the city. We're distributing to nearly 50 locations here, serving over 15,000 meals a day, in addition to our restaurant partners that are operating across Ukraine in cities that are under active bombardment to serve communities and the bomb shelters.
Wow, so it's not just refugees, but those that are under bombardment. I mean, that's incredible. I'm curious, too, personally, Ukrainians, is there a certain dish that they love? Is there something that you're making that they really appreciate? Do they give you feedback?
Yeah, you know, for us, a hot meal is more than just the calories, right? It's really a message. It's symbolic that somebody is caring for you. Somebody is putting love and attention in this really difficult moment where your life has been turned upside down. And so right now, one of the dishes that Ukrainians are really loving, and of course, our Ukrainian chefs here are preparing, is called bogrash. It's a soup, kind of a thick, hearty stew with potatoes and carrots and onions and meats. And so it's very cold here right now. It's well below freezing. Families are arriving by train, by bus at all hours. The train station is active 24 hours a day. So we have these hot soups that families can have when they arrive to warm them up. And that right now really is a really popular dish.
Oh, Nate, that's amazing. You know, we haven't seen a mass evacuation of this many people, as you know, in Europe since World War II. So what's your plan to keep helping these people as this continues to grow, especially as it looks like this isn't going to end anytime soon?
You know, we are, like so many others, hoping for the best, but of course, we have to prepare for the worst. Our World Central Kitchen teams have set up a major operation in Poland, right on the border. We have a big warehouse there. We are producing tens of thousands of meals so we can be there right on the border. As you know, many Ukrainians are traveling for sometimes 48, 72 hours. They haven't had a meal, especially not a hot meal, in days. So we are going to be there and continue to be there for them. Also in countries like Moldova and Romania as well. And here in Ukraine, we are setting up a corridor where we're getting food coming in on trucks. And so we can be ready as potentially millions of Ukrainians get displaced from the east and heading over to Lviv.
Well, it's simply incredible what you are all doing. Nate Mook from World Central Kitchen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, the former college basketball star playing in Ukraine and his dramatic escape from the fighting. Our conversation with him and his parents, now reunited back here in the U.S. right after this break.
More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. Take America's #1 news with you, anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now.
deeper you go into black markets, the darker it gets.
Trafficked, Wednesdays at 9 on National Geographic.
And welcome back. I'm Kira Phillips. Well, he had to memorize 2 phrases in Ukrainian and Russian. Don't shoot and I am American. Former NCAA basketball star Maurice Mo Creek had no idea that when he signed up with the Ukrainian Men's Basketball Super League, that a Russian invasion was actually on the horizon. In just 3 months, Creek was at a crossroads. He says the league downplayed the conflict and gave him an ultimatum: stay and play or leave and not get paid. His mom begged him to flee. Clearly, Mom got her wish, meeting him for an emotional reunion at the airport in Maryland just last week, a long way from the bomb shelter he was in less than a week before. So earlier, I got a chance to speak with Mo and his parents and ask them all how this experience has impacted them as a family.
I was terrified. It was scary, and every moment of it, I'm just thinking, like, how can I get out of Ukraine for my life and to see my family, my friends, and, you know, just have everybody that was praying for me and everything just know that I'm safe and sound.
You actually traveled, I understand, 130 miles from Mykolaiv to Odessa before crossing the border into Moldova, where you were there for 9 hours standing in line. And then you finally made it to Romania, where you were able to catch that flight to get back home to Maryland. What stands out to you the most as you were making that journey?
Having to do all that to go home. I think that 9 hours of just standing still in that line and looking at everybody else trying to get out just as much as I am stood out to me the most. I mean, they had food and drinks out there for everybody, just trying to be a company to them. But just to be out there that long, I still was a part of Ukraine, so I still was being fearful of my life.
Were your teammates saying anything to you, Mo, like, oh, man, you have no idea, you know, what's about to go down? I mean, what were they saying to you?
I think everybody was just scared, so everybody was just attentive to their families, and I was the same way with mine. We have a group chat in Viber where we talk to each other and try to accompany each other at times of need, but at the same time, I know everybody's worried about their own, and, you know, we're not mad at that. When we get to each other, we get to each other.
Wow. So I love that your first phone call was to Mom once you crossed the border. So, Pammy, tell me about getting that phone call.
He said, Mom, I'm free. I'm free. That's all I heard and saw in our chat. So I was so happy, but he still wasn't at peace. It wasn't still a release because he still was not on United States soil. But it was a great feeling just to know that he was, for the most part, out of harm's way.
Okay, and Dad, you got to chime in here. How were you keeping Mom calm? You know, what were your conversations to your son? There had to have been so much going through your mind. I can see it in all 3 of your faces right now.
Yes, I was crying. I mean, crying.
Good. I love it. And massages and telling her to keep calm. So, Mo, how did you finally strike a deal with the league and get enough money to get out of there? Because I know they were really putting pressure on you. How did you finally negotiate something with them so you could just at least get some of the money that you had already earned?
Well, I had to talk to my agent about that a lot. You know, after playing a couple of games and having to go through practices twice a day, once a day sometimes, and you know, I said I can't go away with nothing. You know, I have to be able to come away with something just to be able to do stuff that I need to do to get out. So we had to come to a negotiation in terms, and get my LOC just in case I do have to go and play somewhere else. But all that has to come into terms, and I think that was the fair thing to do. You know, I put my body on the line for these guys every day. I do the best that I can every day to win basketball games. I think the best thing that they could have done was honor the contract to some point in standard and, you know, just get me out of it as safe as time.
Absolutely. And, you know, you have a platform right now here with me. You know, how would you like to lift up your former teammates, especially the Ukrainians? I mean, they are such resilient people. What do you think of the fact that they're, you know, so many of them are staying to fight off the Russians? I mean, how have you been inspired by some of your Ukrainian friends that you met and spent time with?
Man, they're some of the most bravest people I know. You know, not a lot of people can go and say, like, hey, I'm about to fight for my country, you know, and there's 11 of those guys that was on my team, but I know 80% of the league, and 80% got to sit there and fight because they're within the age range of 18 through 65. And
right.
To all those guys, I'm just praying for them. I'm just praying for their families and everything that they are okay, because I'm sitting here and watch it every day, you know, just having to sit back home and watch how everything is just getting bombed down and shot down and everything like that. I'm scared for them. I'm actually scared for everybody in Ukraine, honestly.
And a big thanks to Mo Creek and his parents for that conversation. We'll be following you, Mo. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Kira Phillips. But before we go, the resilience ringing out in Kyiv's Maidan Square. Members of the Ukrainian National Symphony Orchestra have refused to leave their homeland. And because of that, we all get to hear what peace for a moment actually sounds like.
This has been an ABC News Live special.
Putin's war, the innocent victims, the children's hospital bombed, the refugee crisis. Now, Sunday, Martha Raddatz live from the war zone in Ukraine. What will the White House do next? How can this madness end? Sunday on a special edition of ABC's This Week.
Elizabeth Holmes found guilty on 4 counts of fraud, facing the possibility of decades in prison. Now, we take you inside the courtroom and behind the scenes. The Dropout, Elizabeth Holmes on Trial. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Kidnapping on camera. The Ukrainian government claims this video shows Russian troops taking the mayor of the Ukrainian city of Melitopol. Russia is ramping up its assaults on the cities in the south of Ukraine, attacking on every front. But the U.S. reports that 20% of the Russian force is now inoperable, meaning troops are either dead, wounded, or without supplies or equipment. New fears of a false flag operation from Russia. The Biden administration warns that Russia is making claims alleging there are biochemical weapons in Ukraine. The U.S. believes that claim could be used as a false flag to launch those exact kinds of weapons. Russia now bringing hazmat suits into Ukraine. Tonight, President Biden responds to the question, if Russian troops launch a chemical or biological attack in Ukraine, how will the U.S. respond? 2 years in a pandemic world that changes across our country as we adjust to a new normal and emerge from strict restrictions and regulations. ABC News Live talks to an expert about the lessons we've learned in an effort to better confront the next virus. But while the U.S. and much of the world moves on from the worst of COVID, how Hong Kong found itself stuck in a surge.
Now, a lot of elderly people trying to rush in to get vaccinated, but unfortunately, it's far too late, especially in the elderly homes.
And honoring the legacy of a Sesame Street legend who brought love, lessons, and representation to children's television.
This young woman came up and she was crying, you know, and she said, I'm from Colorado, and when I turned on the TV, you were the only other person that looked like me. You were the only one, and I couldn't wait to turn on Sesame Street.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Terry Moran, in for Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. And we begin this Friday night in Ukraine, where Russian forces on the ground are increasingly facing setbacks, but there are growing concerns that the Russians are repositioning troops to encircle and attempt to take the capital city of Kyiv. This as Russian air attacks pound new targets. For the first time, Russia conducting airstrikes on the city of Dnipro. That's Ukraine's third largest city. An advisor to Ukraine's president claims this video shows the kidnapping of the mayor of the Ukrainian city of Melitopol by Russian forces. But the Pentagon now assesses that as much as 1/5 of the Russian force that invaded Ukraine is now, quote, inoperable, meaning the troops are dead, wounded, or have deserted or don't have the logistic support they need to continue in the fight. A defiant President Zelensky of Ukraine tonight saying it's impossible to say how many days we will need to liberate our land, but he says he believes Ukraine is heading towards victory. Looming over all of this, the incredibly disturbing prospect of chemical weapons being deployed, and there's new proof tonight of a possible false flag operation. Ian Pannell, once again, leads us off in Kyiv.
Tonight, Armageddon is how the mayor of Mariupol describes the relentless siege and bombardment of his city. Officials there say it's being shelled every 30 minutes by the Russians and that most of the targets are in residential neighborhoods.
The situation is awful. Russian army continues to do airstrikes, air bombing, artillery shelling.
An overnight missile strike on Mariupol's emergency services center reportedly cut one of the last lines of communication to the outside world. Along the coast in Mykolaiv, the mayor claims Russians have been using cluster bombs, which disperse bomblets over wide areas. While the UN stopped short of saying Russia's committed war crimes, it is now saying it's received credible reports of Russia using cluster bombs in populated areas like Kharkiv. The deliberate use of these weapons on civilians is a war crime. In Dnipro, in the east, more disturbing images of the aftermath of a Russian airstrike, this time destroying a shoe factory. An elementary school was also reportedly hit. Even in cities that have fallen, there's still popular resistance. In Melitopol, residents have been protesting the occupying Russian forces. The mayor has been insisting publicly the city is still part of Ukraine. Today, an advisor to Ukraine's president claims this video shows the kidnapping of the mayor by a group of heavily armed Russian troops. Russian authorities tonight saying they've opened a criminal case against the mayor on charges of aiding terrorism. Despite the dire situation in many parts of the country, there are ominous warnings today of how much worse it could get. Amid fears, Russia might stage a chemical weapons attack in the country. The World Health Organization's urging Ukraine to immediately destroy pathogen samples in labs because Russia's war in the country risks an accidental spill. And today, Moscow's saying Europe's largest nuclear power plant now belongs to Russia. Its forces took control of the facility last week after fighting that triggered concerns about a potential nuclear disaster. Across Ukraine, the Russians are intensifying their attacks on major cities. Airstrikes expanding to 2 airfields in western Ukraine. New satellite images show the Russian convoy that once stretched 40 miles northwest of the capital has dispersed and repositioned into attack positions and are as close as 9 miles from the city centre. There's been intense fighting near the outskirts of the capital.
We've just seen what we think is an air intercept. You can see the streaks up in the sky there as we're not clear whether it was Russian jets or was it Ukrainian jets. But that's the reality on the ground for people living inside the capital today.
Ukraine's President Zelensky said today the country is reaching a breakthrough moment and is heading towards victory. But that may seem like a dream to many here.
We're seeing hundreds, thousands of people now fleeing frontline towns. Most of these people are from the town of Bucha. They've been hiding in their basements, caught in the middle of the bombardment. Some are saying they've seen Russian tanks and armored vehicles inside their village, and they've left with what little they can carry, many of them waving white flags to signal that they're civilians and shouldn't be harmed.
Katerina Sipsai managed to escape from Bucha with her grandmother today before it got too late. Surrounded by the Russian army, the town's been bombarded since the start of the invasion.
Being without water and electricity for almost 7 days is not fun, so we decided to evacuate today,
Yeah, and is there much fighting going on there?
Yes, you can actually see a lot of Russian tanks and explosions. Like, you go to bed every day with explosions. You wake up today at 5 a.m. I woke up with the sounds of explosions, so yeah, not fun.
Her grandmother, Katerina Romanivna, has lost her home, left her village, and is out in the cold. But incredibly, accepting the uncertainty of her future.
How do you keep your spirits up?
What else can you do, she says.
Ian Pannell joins us now. Ian, I've been looking at these maps that show the Russian forces squeezing, grinding towards Kyiv, and you talked about the fighting around the city intensifying, and I'm thinking of you, we all are, and of all the people in Kyiv. How does it feel there? How does it feel given what the Russian forces are doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed, it's evolved. I mean, I think since you were here, it's become more intense, the city has become more reinforced, people are digging in everywhere. I mean, the one small saving grace, I guess, of the slow pace of the Russian advancement is it has allowed people to dig in. You see fortifications every 200 or 300 yards around the city. Sandbags get higher, trenches get dug deeper. You see these tank traps on the road. We know that they're receiving increasing amounts of weapons. And the mood in the city is one of resolve. But of course, everyone's watching these pictures from Mariupol, from Kharkiv, from other cities, and they know what is likely to come here. So we now know that the Kremlin has troops about 9 miles to the northwest of here, and although they haven't pushed any closer, US officials are saying that they're seeing reinforcements coming up to support those frontline troops. And to the east of here, again, the Kremlin's forces are about 12 miles away from the city limits. It's not that far, and again, you're seeing more troops coming in from the north. Now, I think what is true is at the moment they don't have the forces in place to be able to encircle the city, but it's also clear that this is Putin's primary objective, to take the capital, to decapitate the government in its own words, and essentially try and install its own puppet government. And that perhaps leads to an end of this conflict. But that doesn't feel like it's going to happen anytime soon, and it certainly is not going to be easy in any sense. Terry?
Ian Pannell is the eyes of the world on that city there in Kyiv. Thank you very much for your continued reporting on this. Stay safe, my friend. Well, the grinding war isn't going as Vladimir Putin planned, and U.S. intelligence is warning that with his original strategy failing now, Putin may launch a false flag operation so Russia could then deploy deadly chemical or biological weapons. ABC's Martha Raddatz reports from Lviv in western Ukraine.
Tonight, new and increasingly ominous signs the Russian assault could take a more brutal turn. A senior U.S. official saying some Russian soldiers now bringing in chem-bio suits to protect against chemical and biological weapons, fearing that false flag event meant to justify Russia's own use of chemical weapons. Today, the U.S. ambassador to the UN slamming Russia for spreading disinformation.
We have serious concerns that Russia may be planning to use chemical or biological agents against the Ukrainian people.
As Russia now expands its attacks for the first time into western Ukraine with those deadly missile strikes, this while its ground forces are closing in on the capital.
The Russians are beginning to make more momentum on the ground towards Kyiv.
A U.S. official saying for Vladimir Putin, everything depends on taking Kyiv. But fierce Ukrainian resistance, these images from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry capturing this ambush of the Russian convoy, is taking a toll. As many as 6,000 Russian soldiers have died, another 15,000 wounded since the war began. And a U.S. official saying as much as 1/5 of the Russian force now inoperable, dead, wounded, or simply bogged down. The U.S. official calling it a fundamental failure in Russia's planning and operations. But Putin trying to adapt, the Kremlin saying 16,000 fighters from the Middle East, including Syria, heading to Ukraine to help them out.
And Martha Raddatz joins us now from Lviv in western Ukraine. Martha, this is now week 3 we're into in this war. Do you see the Russian strategy changing and, more importantly, accomplishing something?
It absolutely has to change from Vladimir Putin's viewpoint, but despite the fact that his troops are bogged down in certain areas, he really can inflict catastrophic damage. We're already seeing that with indiscriminate bombing from missiles and artillery fire, very similar to what he did in Grozny, Terry.
All right, Martha Raddatz, thanks very much. Stay safe. And be sure to tune in to This Week, this Sunday, where Martha Raddatz will bring us the latest from Lviv. President Biden today tightened the economic screws on Russia, cutting off normal trade relations, which is a major benefit under U.S. law, and banning Russian imports like caviar, vodka, and diamonds. But the president said again the U.S., quote, will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine. Let's bring in ABC's senior White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. So, Mary, the president was pressed today about whether the U.S. would have a military response if Russian forces under Putin use chemical weapons in Ukraine. And how did the president respond?
Well, Terry, the president said that Russia would pay a, quote, severe price. But tonight it's not clear what that price would be. I've asked, but the White House says they're not going to engage in hypotheticals. They are, though, increasingly warning that Russia could use chemical or biological weapons. They certainly have launched these kinds of attacks in the past. And while the president today wouldn't give a definitive answer as to whether this kind of attack would prompt the U.S. to intervene militarily, Biden again today was emphatic that American forces will not engage directly with the Russians in Ukraine. Biden again saying that would be World War III. Terry.
Yet they are sanctions to the hilt. Hard to see what the next steps would be. Thank you, Mary Bruce. And we are joined now by ABC News contributor and retired Colonel Steve Ganyard. Thanks for joining us, Steve. So we just heard from Martha there about reports that Russians are starting to bring in biochemical weapon suits into Ukraine. I mean, could this really happen? Well, what's your assessment of what is going on around the issue of chemical weapons being deployed in this terrible war?
I think, Terry, it's a question of what kind of intelligence the U.S. see. Were these sort of specialized units in full hazmat suits, or were these troops coming in with their chem bio gear? You know, some of the gear that we've seen already from Russians that have been killed, they have gas masks from the 1950s. So it's really hard for average soldiers to practice chemical and biological weapon defense. And I think in this case, if they did it, they probably will kill plenty of their own. And as for a false flag, you know, their false flag operations so far have been so improbable that it's not for the world. The world's not going to believe their false flag. It's for Russian domestic opinion consumption to justify any atrocities they might commit.
Yeah, it is hard to see how anyone could believe what comes out of the Kremlin at this point. But so think of these Ukrainian troops who have, you know, they're getting pounded by artillery and missiles, and it's hard for them to deal with that, but have demonstrated opportunism and that they're nimble around, and they really have caused some problems for the Russian forces. How can Ukraine, how can those troops and the civilians prepare for the possibility of some kind of chemical attack? Well, what do you think?
Yeah, you really can't. Terry, the least likely is a biological attack. Most of the Russian bioweapons research, at least notionally, ended back in the 90s. Bioweapons are really tough because you don't know where they are, and they tend to spread in uncontrollable ways. We do know that the Russians were complicit in the gassing of Syrian civilians, so it's not something that's beyond Mr. Putin. But I think we need to look at something even more concerning, and that is the testimony that the CIA director and the Defense Intelligence Agency director gave to Congress this week. They both talked about this idea of Putin needing to escalate to de-escalate. And one of the things that they mentioned was the use of tactical nuclear weapons. We need to consider that that is the third option after bio and chemical attacks. It is part of the Russian warfighting repertoire. They see tactical nuclear weapons as something that can be used on the battlefield, whereas the U.S. looks at those as strategic deterrents. The Russians routinely wargame the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and so don't put it past Mr. Putin to test one of those, to try and change the calculus, change the negotiation in a way that's favorable to him, in a way that he would want to bring this to an end.
Wow. The unimaginable now possibly on the horizon. And Steve, I want to ask you about this. We heard from a senior administration official told ABC News that about 1/5, 20% of Russian forces, according to this official, are currently, quote, inoperable. So it appears their strategy hinges on taking over Kyiv and other big cities, and that convoy now moving. Where does Kyiv stand now, and what do you make of that assessment that as many as 20% of Russia's forces are out of the fight at this point?
Yeah, that's a really remarkable number, Terry. If you get to around 30%, somewhere around there, that is a combat ineffective unit. So there have been some military analysts who think that the Russians have about 2.5 weeks left in this military before they just become exhausted. But you can see as Martha talked about and Ian talked about, the encirclement of Kyiv continues. And the thing that's most worrying here is that the Russians know how tough urban combat is, so they probably won't come into the city. They'll do what they did in Grozny, do what they did in Aleppo, and they'll just stand off at about 10 miles and fire artillery shell after artillery shell into those civilian areas and just level them until the Ukrainians give up.
It's the Russian way of war, the Putin way of war. Colonel Steve Ganyard, thanks very much. Well, and now let's go inside Russia. The Kremlin making it illegal to log onto Facebook or Instagram in Russia. What do the Russian people, what could they face if they do it? ABC's James Longman is in Moscow for us tonight.
Vladimir Putin's assault on free speech intensifying tonight. Facebook's parent company Meta is to be designated an extremist organization. People who log into Facebook or Instagram here could now be tried under the same laws as ISIS terrorists. Moscow says it's in response to Meta's easing of its hate speech guidelines, which allow Ukrainians the ability to call for violence against Russians fighting in their country. The move further limits Russian access to non-state sanctioned information, but young people here will find a way. It's a shame, this young man says, but you can survive without it. The bloggers I'm following will all move to Telegram, and I'll follow them there. Ekaterina Kotrikadze is an anchor of the now closed Liberal Reign TV station, where staff walked out following a media crackdown.
A lot of people, just like me, have lost everything because of one man's decisions. So, yeah, it's horrible.
She now left the country for her own safety, and she tells me many young men are leaving too, worried that even though Putin has insisted there'll be no